So, so I've heard people being told by their doctor that their blood pressure, for example, is just hereditary. And to what extent is blood pressure itself a disease versus a benchmark for a disease? And what do you think about when people are told that their high pressure is just hereditary?
I think that that's probably not the whole truth. Yes, there are some hereditary forms of high blood pressure, but the vast majority of high blood pressure is environmental. Remember, roughly 50% of Americans have some form of heart disease, most of which is high blood pressure. And a lot of that is not hereditary. A lot of that is environmental. When you're eating an ultra processed Western diet, stressed to the max, sitting around all day and not exercising, the body's response to this is typically to raise blood pressure, and we need to do better to get rid of that.
And what would be the mechanism for why those activities and that lifestyle would increase blood pressure?
I'm not sure I could tell you. There's probably lots of them, right? We call it essential hypertension in medicine, which means we essentially don't know the cause. And so, what I would say is that, if you eat lots of salt and you have lots of stress, I mean, the very word hypertension means too much tension. And so, a lot of it may have to do with the way the kidneys process the foods we eat and the chemicals that they release to regulate blood pressure. Of course, under stress, our blood pressure always shoots up. We're under that flight or fight response, right? When something bad happens or your boss comes, yells at you or whatever it is, we kind of clamp down and our blood pressure goes up. But there's probably at least a dozen different mechanisms. And I think it's just a maladaptive survival mechanism that doesn't really exist in populations that don't live a Western lifestyle.
And what about taking things like losartan and other blood pressure medications to lower your blood pressure? Does that confer lifelong benefits, or is that just reducing a benchmark that it looks good on a test, but may not have the life impact that people expect it to?
Yeah, so I always tell people you really should do what your doctor says. And if they tell you that you should be on losartan, it's a generic drug, it's highly effective. And the reason is that blood pressure is one of the most potent of all risk factors. So for every 20 points your blood pressure goes above 120 on average, your risk for dying doubles. So it is an exponential risk. And it may mean that you start with a drug and you change your lifestyle and you come off the drug. My favorite day in clinic is when someone calls me up and says, Doc, I can barely open my eyes. My blood pressure is 90. Can I get off this thing? And the answer, of course, is almost always yes, because they have changed their lifestyle. But I think if you are, running around with a blood pressure of 200 and you're going to start eating some peas tonight, you're putting yourself in great risk. So I always tell people it's important to to put out the fire before you start planting flowers.
Okay, thank you for that. And what are simple ways for somebody who's interested in bettering their lifestyle to get started?
Well, visit with a lifestyle medicine specialist. As you may know, there's something called the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which has a whole variety of doctors that do lots of good things, and you can find them virtually or in person, and find someone to help guide you with all the various pillars. Most of them are common sense, right? It's eating plants, it's exercising more, it's stressing less, it's sleeping enough, it's loving more, connecting with others, and of course, not smoking or using much of any alcohol. And those sound really easy, but of course they're completely counter for what to most Western societies' lifestyles. So I would encourage you to work with some experts. And it takes a village, right? When you're 50 or 60 or 70 years old and you see somebody like me and I tell you that I want you to make a 70-year habit change, some people get angry, right? And I get that, right? Because it sounds like you're being critical. But what I'm really trying to do is change their life trajectory, because they might have, if they're lucky, another 50 years ahead of them. And I certainly don't want them to spend it with me and having procedures done to them when they could be out enjoying life.
So, what are the essential medical tests that everyone should consider getting regularly to ensure optimal health and early detection of potential health issues?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a consensus answer on that, right? So if you go to a place that does executive health or concierge medicine, they're going to offer you all this stuff that you may not necessarily need. So I guess what I would do is I would talk with your primary care doctor or your whoever your primary care person is and get a sense of what you might need. But in general, some of the things that I help use for prevention, of course, are standard blood work, blood chemistry, blood count, a lipid panel. Almost everybody I check at least once for something called lipoprotein A, with which 1 in 5 people has and is associated with early heart disease. And then for some people who have additional risk or a concern, I'll often end up with a calcium score and sometimes something called a cardiac CT angiogram, which gives me a real picture of their coronary arteries. But those need some discussion and pros and cons and risk versus benefit discussions with someone who knows what they're doing. There are lots of places you can go. You can go to those trucks that come to everyone's town and get all these tests. Be careful. You really do get what you pay for. If you pay $99 for tests that would normally cost much more, you may end up with a test that comes out falsely abnormal, which not only creates enormous stress in your life, but then somebody like me has to repeat and figure out if it's actually real or not. And many times they're not. So talk with a qualified person who understands prevention, do all your age appropriate cancer screenings, and do your best to make sure that your cardiovascular risk remains low, and check with someone who's qualified in this to help you. Not all card carrying cardiologists do prevention. Not all card carrying primary care doctors do prevention. So make sure you talk with people that are in the know.
So how does the whole food plant-based diet align with the Ornish intensive cardiac rehab program you oversee?
So the Ornish Intensive Cardiac Rehab Program makes people commit, at least for 9 weeks, to a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. And so we teach them how to eat. There's an RD that helps to do that. And then we actually give them a meal at every session, which is twice a week, so that they can see that these foods are tasty and delicious.
Could you explain the physiological effects of plant-based diets on arterial health?
Yeah, it turns out that when you eat a diet that's rich in antioxidants and potassium, it has a blood pressure lowering effect and a blood vessel relaxing effect. You may even see people who are hardcore athletes out there doping with beet juice or beet greens for this very reason. And it turns out there's a whole variety of mechanisms at play. And in fact, there was one study that showed that vegan athletes actually tend to run cooler under long distance running conditions. So there's a variety of mechanisms at play. But it turns out that many of the high fat animal foods have been shown to temporarily disable or shut down the endothelial cells that line our very blood vessels. You may have seen some studies back probably 30 or 40 years ago where someone ate a very high fat cheeseburger and then they measured the reactivity of the endothelial cells and they were markedly reduced or off, which is pretty amazing. And as you may know, the endothelial cells release nitric oxide, which helps to relax the blood vessels.
So we have many speakers, and they talk about cholesterol, particularly in regards to cardiovascular health. We had one speaker who was talking about, cholesterol levels when they're higher, people have better health outcomes. Most of the people that we've had speak during this conference so far have said no, that's not correct. The lower, the better. What does the science show on levels of cholesterol, and what does cholesterol actually mean? Kind of like how I asked earlier about, benchmarks with regard to high blood pressure. Is cholesterol a benchmark for cardiovascular disease, or is that an issue in and of itself that should be treated directly?
Yeah, there are some conditions where cholesterol by itself is a significant risk factor, but I want to point out that a lot of people focus on cholesterol, and it's really the cardiovascular risk that we're after. And cholesterol is an imperfect surrogate for that cardiovascular risk. We combine it with blood pressure and age and gender, and then, of course, the cholesterol. So there are a number of very good quality, large publications and studies that show that LDL is likely causal for coronary disease. But many people will cite some papers that show, like in the elderly, perhaps it's not much of an effect. And I think a lot of these are not necessarily done as well as we would like. And I would say that all of the leading world experts would tell you that cholesterol and cardiovascular risk go hand in hand. But I'll be the first to tell you that it is not perfect, but it's certainly helpful. And of course, when people get put on statins or change their lifestyle, we see their LDL go down. We also see their cardiovascular risk go down. And at the end of the day, the cholesterol is less important to me than the actual risk of having an event or dying, right? At the end of the day, if your cholesterol is 1 million and you live, 30 seconds, that's not what I want, right? I want you to have a long, good quality of life. So
we've had some speaker on this topic of cholesterol being a risk say that you'd have to be like 10,000 people would have to be on cholesterol for a certain period of time to have, I forget how many people they say have to prevent a cardiac event. What does the literature show on that?
yeah, so I mean, the effect of, I think you meant statins, but the effect of
That's
statins
right.
on lowering cardiovascular risk is significant. you can see magnitude risk reduction approaching 30% in some populations. So in general, I guess what I would throw out to you is if you look at the best science, and I claim to be an evidence-based, guideline-driven cardiologist, there's never been a study of lifestyle versus a statin in a large randomized controlled trial without confounders to say that one is better than the other. Most likely, we probably need to have people go on an excellent lifestyle to prevent events. But if you've already had an event, you're automatically at high risk for a future event. And those people typically do benefit from statins. And some people might find it strange to see statins and a low fat, whole food, plant based diet and exercise and all those other pillars. But to me, they're likely synergistic. And that seems to be where the risk is the lowest. And have I seen people, unfortunately, who have followed an amazing lifestyle and have still had heart attacks? I have. And so the question is, would they have not had that if they were on a statin? Well, they may have still have, but their risk would likely be less. So I liken statins to seatbelts, right? Why do you wear a seatbelt? Because if you're going to go get into a car accident, the likelihood of dying from that car accident is reduced when you wear a seatbelt. And the likelihood of having a significant cardiovascular event is reduced when you're on a statin. And again, I'm not pushing one in front of the other,